This is the news in brief from the United Nations. In West and Central Africa, 3.4 million people need help after destructive flooding, the UN Refugee Agency UNHCR said on Friday. The alert comes amid the worst floods in a decade. They've swept across Nigeria, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali and Cameroon. UNHCR spokesperson Olga Serrado said that hundreds of people had died in Nigeria, where floodwaters in the northeast swept through sites for internally displaced people and host communities in Borno, Adamawa and Yobe states. Ms. Serrado added that temperatures in the Sahel are also rising 1.5 times faster than the global average.
The climate crisis is happening now, and as we are seeing in these communities, it's destroying livelihoods, it's disrupting food security, but also aggravating conflicts in between communities over scarce resources and driving further displacement.
More than 1.3 million people have been displaced so far in Nigeria, and 2.8 million have been impacted by flooding, with farmlands and roads submerged. In central Sahel countries, Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso, above-average rains and flooding have killed hundreds, displaced thousands and decimated over 1 million hectares of cropland. To help those most in need in West and Central Africa, UNHCR appealed to all donors for urgent support, as its humanitarian operations there are dangerously and chronically underfunded. Russia should repeal and not expand already restrictive LGBTI laws, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said on Friday. The appeal from the UN's new rights chief, Volker Turk, followed Thursday's decision by the Russian parliament to move towards broadening a ban on the sharing of information about lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people and their rights. The Russian Duma's decision infringes even further on international human rights norms and standards and is deeply concerning, OHCHR spokesperson Rivyana Shamdasani told journalists in Geneva. She explained that the latest LGBTI restrictions stem from 2013 legislation that was itself condemned by independent human rights experts as discriminatory and violating fundamental rights to freedom of expression.
One of the arguments that is sometimes brought forth is that such legislation is important for the protection of children. In fact, what the Committee on the Rights of the Child has found is that rather than protecting children, such legislation leads to the targeting and ongoing persecution, including abuse and violence of children as well.
96,000 Haitians have now been forced to leave their homes because of spiralling gang violence in the capital, Port-au-Prince. In an alert on Friday, UN Migration Agency IOM said that the number of people displaced there has tripled in the past 5 months. It pointed to racketeering, kidnappings and other criminal activity, all taking place in a context of deep inequality, high levels of deprivation and a fragmented security environment. Neighbourhoods in the capital which face the highest levels of violence are victims of economic distress, made worse by recent surges in food and fuel prices that have destabilised people's livelihoods. Ulrika Richardson, UN resident coordinator in Haiti, insisted that the United Nations was working with humanitarian, government and local partners to help alleviate hardships of the most vulnerable families. Daniel Johnson, UN News.
This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The UN Secretary-General says that he is deeply saddened by the tragic loss of life in the Itaewon district of Seoul in the Republic of Korea over the weekend, in which 154 people died and more than 130 were injured. There are fears that the death toll due to the stampede in the crowded entertainment district could rise. Antonio Guterres expressed his sincere condolences to the families of the victims, many of whom were teenagers and people in their 20s, as well as to the government and people of South Korea. An estimated 100,000 people had gathered in Itaewon for the country's biggest Halloween festivities since the COVID-19 pandemic began, and strict rules on gatherings were enforced. On Monday, the country's Prime Minister, Han Duck-soo, announced a thorough investigation into the stampede, and President Yoon Suk-yeol declared a day of national mourning. The outlook for global markets has worsened in recent months, with job vacancies and job growth likely to decline significantly in the final quarter of 2022, according to a new report by the International Labour Organization, or ILO. The 10th edition of the Monitor on the World of Work finds that rising inflation is causing real wages to fall in many countries. This comes on top of significant declines in income during the COVID-19 crisis, which affected low-income groups the most in many countries. The report also finds that labour market inequalities are likely to increase, contributing to a continued divergence between developed and developing economies. Gilbert Hangbo, ILO Director General, says that a set of multiple and overlapping crises, compounded by the war in Ukraine, are having a deep impact on the world of work.
Altogether, this is undoubtedly a grim global picture, but we are not helpless. If we take the right steps, we can shape what happens next. And to do this, our policy choices need to be integrated, balanced, and comprehensive, and take into account sectoral, labor market, and social factors, as well as the financial factors.
And finally, many oil and gas companies are increasing their efforts to tackle methane, one of the biggest and most solvable contributors to the climate crisis. But more needs to be done, according to a report launched on Monday at a major gathering of the industry. The report, An Eye on Methane, International Methane Emissions Observatory 2022, was presented by the UN Environment Programme, or UNEP, in Abu Dhabi. It shows that over 80 oil and gas companies across the world have committed to measuring and reducing their methane emissions. Inga Anderson, Executive Director of UNEP, said that cutting methane emissions is the fastest way to tackle climate change in the short term, as it remains in the atmosphere for far fewer years than carbon dioxide. Despite the relative progress, corporations need to move faster and harder, she urged. Nikki Chadwick, UN News.